Hello, my name is Irina Nevzlin, and I'm the chairman of the board of the Museum of the Jewish People, and I'm very happy to have with me here today Lord Jacob Rothschild. Jacob, thank you for coming.
Not at all.
I know how proud you are to be Jewish.
Yes.
I know how Zionist you are.
Right.
And I know that it comes from the family, but it's also very personal for you. And I also know that you didn't grow up actually in a very Jewish environment. So I want to understand, what does it mean for you to be Jewish?
I mean, if you look at my family history, my father, although he wasn't religious, he was interested in Jewish life. He was involved in Israel. He went to the Weizmann Institute often. He didn't bring his children up to be very aware of that. And it really wasn't until later in life, my early 20s, that I became close to my cousin, Mrs. James de Rothschild, who was rather Orthodox. And she invited me to join the board of Yad Hanadiv, which I did, when we had 4 people. And that was more than 50 years ago. And since then, the responsibility for which he'd really trained me was one I've discharged to the best of my abilities. And we now have 45 people in Jerusalem and a large number of projects, including the project which I've been now working on for 15 years, which is the new National Library in Israel. So yeah, I'm deeply involved, not so much because I'm religious, but because I have this wholly strong identification with being a Jew and with the country of Israel. One of the reasons for that is, I mean, that the last 50 years have been good times, basically, economically, and we invested the monies of Hanadiv, I think, well. So it's now a big foundation. I think it's the biggest private foundation in Israel. And with that, you have the opportunity to do all sorts of things. So we're working not only on a big flagship project, we do those very occasionally, like the Supreme Court. Then we look after the garden, Ramat Hanadiv, where Baron Edmore is now buried within the garden. We get, I think, 400,000 visitors a year, and keep it up to good standards. We do a lot on education. We do a lot on the environment, which is not a subject that's covered very well in Israel.
That subject didn't exist 10
years
ago.
And we felt this is a real opportunity. So if you have environmental problems like water, is obviously a hugely important subject. If you take Arab-Israeli relationships, we've spent a lot of money with the government in setting up employment centers for Arabs, because that's one of the big problems is unemployment, etc., etc. So
that's also new, right?
That's a fairly new project. That's a fairly new project. We've given a certain amount of money towards women's unemployment, particularly Arab women. So we're pretty active across the board, I think, in Hanadiv now.
And what about Hanadiv Europe and also Jewish community here and not also Jewish?
Well, we have another foundation called Rothschild Hanadiv Europe, which it's smaller, but it's very active, and we tend to focus more on cultural and historic events by supporting buildings, synagogues, museums, cultural initiatives, scholarships, and all that.
Remember your first visit to Israel?
I remember it very well. I went in 1962, and I was very lucky because I went under the auspices of the philosopher Isaiah Berlin, and I went with him, Nicholas Nabokov, Isaac Stern, the violinist, and Raimund von Hofmannsthal, who was the son of the Hofmannsthal of Strauss' days. And life was very different in Israel then. We went around kibbutzes hearing Isaac Stern, Casals, Mervyn Rose, Istomin playing.
I understand that you were in Israel, in Jerusalem actually, at the Six-Day War.
I was there, yeah. It was very odd. I was asleep, and then the telephone rang, and it was Marcus Seep, who also was a big influence on my life in those early days. And he said, "We're going." So I said, "Where?" He said, we're going to the war. I said, "Okay, I'll get up." And we went to the airport and we flew off.
Kids, do they consider themselves Jewish, religious? Like, how does
They're
it
not religious, but if you take my daughter Hannah, she's very committed to the work of Yad Hanadiv. She's a trustee. And so they're all, my daughter Beth is actually converting, because she's not in formal terms Jewish, she's actually converting. And she's been to Israel many times. She worked in the botanical gardens there, that's her thing, horticulture. And so, yeah, it continues, it'll continue. The extraordinary part of the history of the Jews is that for thousands of years that situation has been there, and yet somehow those widely spread Jewish communities kept their spirit through good and bad times. And it's a phenomenon that it's difficult to explain, but the light continues, the commitment continues. Even though, of course, you had a very divided Jewish community 100 years ago. We're going to celebrate the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, which is a kind of Magna Carta of the Jewish people of 100 years ago, Magna Carta in terms of coming back to their homeland. And you had then a difficult choice. I mean, half of my family were very against the idea of a home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And the other half were for it. Now, that situation will never go away, but the presence of the Jewish community, whether in Israel or outside Israel, I think the light's undimmed. I think it's an extraordinary period.
Can you tell now, after 50 years of being involved with Yad Hanadiv, which things work and which things don't?
In educational terms, yes. I mean, I think, again, it's a kind of miracle that in science and technology, Israel remains at the forefront of the world. How does that happen? It's a complicated question, but it has happened, and they have that spirit which keeps that going. I think with the humanities, it's more difficult because we live in an age when the humanities are underfunded by government, where it's not seen to be a priority. But then on the other hand, you look at something like the Israel Museum, which has been a success on a world scale. And so, again, in spite of all those difficulties, the light continues.
What would you wish for younger Jews?
I would wish for them, obviously, to be aware of their being Jewish, and for the history of the Jewish people to rub off on them to a certain level, to give them the opportunity at least to understand, and let's hopefully that they respond to that. I hope too that this creation of this state and home of Israel in what was Palestine is something that younger Jews will visit, because that opens their eyes to the Jewish people and a very, very, very important side of the Jewish people today, perhaps the most important side of Jewish people. So awareness is something I would continually underline.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jacob Rothschild accidentally admits the New World Order is finished. Rothschild Empire is looking at financial turmoil. Lord Jacob Rothschild has accidentally admitted that the plan for the New World Order is collapsing according to a new report. The Rothschild empire is now looking at fresh financial turmoil as suggested by the RIT Capital Partners 2016 year-end report, which could also have a huge effect for the rest of the planet. Jacob Rothschild also recently announced that he is to buy up all remaining gold to replace stock market and currency exposure, which signals the biggest financial crash since the Lehman Brothers crash in 2008. The FreeThoughtProject.com reports. The investment banker's chosen word of period seems to indicate a coming downturn in profitability, even though for the past 5 years the fund has realized a profit of more than €1 billion. According to the report, Rothschild and his very powerful family have a vested interest in preserving their assets. RIT Capital Partners plc is an investment company listed on the London Stock Exchange. Its net assets have grown from £280 million on listing in 1988 to over £2.7 billion today. RIT is chaired by Lord Rothschild, whose family interests retain a significant holding, the issue reveals. If the fund, whose value is at an all-time high, suddenly declines, falling with it will be a large portion of wealth the Rothschild family enjoys. Although any such declines would hardly come as a surprise to the Rothschild family, who reportedly controls much of the world's wealth and has a hand in nearly all of the world's banking institutions, including the Federal Reserve, as some have stated. The chairman's statement continues with what some might say is an ominous and uncertain view of the future. Since the last World War, we have enjoyed some 70 years of patiently crafted international cooperation, which is now threatened. An apparent reference to Brexit and the UK's referendum to withdraw from the European Union. Against this deeply worrying geopolitical situation, he wrote, seeming to highlight the potential of WWII if the Syrian conflict continues. One can point to a number of positive investment factors, echoing many statements made by the current U.S. President. Lord Rothschild stated he was hopeful corporations would receive a break in government-imposed revenue. He said in the U.S. the proposed tax reduction for companies and individuals was a favorable policy change for his fund's portfolio, resounding President Trump's call for deregulation. Rothschild also was reportedly pleased with the reforms of an over-regulated system. Likewise, in step with Trump's call to exponentially increase spending on America's failing transportation infrastructure, Lord Rothschild is pleased. However, Trump's call for increases in fiscal and infrastructure expenditure come at a time late in the business cycle, when the labor market is close to full employment, meaning there's no forecast of immediate returns on infrastructure spending forecasted in the future. The banking and financial baron also seemed to limit that wage increases up by some 4% over the last few months, a factor which affects the bottom line for every company. He also stated across the fund's portfolio will also be affected by rising interest rates. Valuations are at the high end of their historical range. Inflation is returning, and in these circumstances, it is likely that interest rates in the U.S. will rise meaningfully, he said. And coming from the man whose familial connections and financial partners control the Federal Reserve, he should know.